My name is Edgar Allan Poe, and if you know my name, you likely know of my shadows. I am often remembered as a symbol of horror, a gloomy poet, one who spoke with the abyss. But before I became the voice of darkness, I was a man. And my life was far from easy. Like my poems, it began with loss. I was born in Boston on the 19th of January, 1809. My parents were actors. My mother, Elizabeth Arnold Hopkins Poe, was an actress by calling and talent. My father, David Poe Jr., was a man of unsteady temperament and weak will. He abandoned us when I was very young and soon vanished from our lives entirely. My mother died of tuberculosis when I was only 2 years old. She died alone, in the arms of kind strangers, in a foreign house. I do not remember her face, but it always seemed to me that her eyes haunted me from my earliest dreams. I was taken in by the Allan family of Richmond, John and Frances Allan. They did not formally adopt me, but they gave me a name, a roof, and food. John was a stern tobacco merchant, reserved in affection and generosity. Frances was kind, gentle, and if there was ever a figure in my life who could be called a true mother, it was she. I called them uncle and aunt, but neither ever became truly close to me. I was always an outsider in their home, a half-orphan with books in my hands and a shadow in my eyes. From my earliest years, I was drawn to literature. I read everything I could: English poets, Latin philosophers, anything I could find. Words felt like salvation. They gave me power over feelings I could not otherwise express. At 8 years old, I was already writing my first lines, dark, anxious, filled with longing and images of death. Not because I wanted to seem strange, but because that was all I knew. In 1816, when I was 7 years old, the Allans took me with them to England. There, I studied in private schools and lived near London. I remember foggy streets, gothic facades of buildings, cold classrooms, and endless rain. England left a mark on me that never faded. Those gray skies were like my thoughts, without a glimmer of light. Returning to America, I continued my studies. I was clever, but moody. They called me talented, but unpredictable. I dreamed of becoming a poet, but Allan wanted me to be a businessman. We clashed more and more. He did not understand why I wrote, why I read, why I needed poetry. I could not understand how one could live without it. In 1826, I enrolled at the University of Virginia. I was 17 years old. I studied well, but soon began drowning in debt. John Allan gave me only a fraction of what I needed, hinting I should learn to manage on my own. I started gambling, lost, borrowed, and lost again. Money became my first true enemy. I left the university, not by choice, but by necessity. In despair, I left home. I wanted to be a poet. I wanted to be myself. I went to Boston and published my first collection of poems, Tamerlane and Other Poems. It was not destined to be popular, but for me it was an act of freedom. I proved to myself that I could be heard. Penniless and unsupported, I joined the army. I enlisted under the name Edgar A. Perry. I served as any young man would who needed to survive. I was sent to Fort Moultrie, then to Fort Monroe. I was no hero, but neither was I a coward. I followed orders, read poetry in my spare time, gazed at the sea, and wondered how far it could carry me from everything. After 2 years of service, I sought to leave the army. I needed Allan's consent. He was silent for a long time. Then he sent a letter, cold and distant. We barely spoke. Frances died, and I felt that even the faint bond between me and Allan was gone. Still, he helped me gain admission to the West Point Military Academy, but I no longer believed in a military career. I deliberately broke rules, skipped classes, ignored orders. I was expelled, and I was glad of it. I returned to literature. I published new poems, wrote stories. I entered literary contests. In 1833, my story, MS Found in a Bottle, won a prize, $50. It was my first recognition. I felt I could be a writer not just by calling, but by craft. I began working for magazines, writing criticism, editing, publishing my own stories. In 1835, I joined the Southern Literary Messenger. My criticism was sharp, precise, merciless. I did not hesitate to call mediocrity what it was. This made me enemies, but also earned respect. People read my articles because they were bold, alive, uncompromising. That same year, I married. Her name was Virginia Clem. She was only 13. I was 26. Yes, her age was often remarked upon, but believe me, what we had transcended worldly bounds. Virginia was my muse, my light, my peace. Her voice echoed in my mind as I wrote. Her touch calmed my nightly fears. We lived in poverty, dire poverty. Sometimes we had no money for coal, food, or paper. We moved from city to city, Richmond, Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore. I wrote whatever I could, stories, articles, poems. Every text was a battle between hunger and inspiration. My pen grew sharper. I wrote The Fall of the House of Usher, Berenice, Ligeia, The Masque of the Red Death. Readers were either enthralled or turned away in fear. I did not write for sensation. I wrote to release the darkness within. Otherwise, it would have consumed me. I drank. Yes, I won't deny it. Alcohol dulled the pain, if only for a while. I was often accused of debauchery, but no one saw what raged inside. I was like a glass bottle filled with a storm, transparent on the outside, turbulent within. But there was a moment when everything changed. In 1845, I published a poem that turned my life upside down. It began simply, "Once upon a midnight dreary." So began the poem that became my curse and my immortality. The Raven was published in 1845 and took New York by storm. People quoted it, printed it on covers, discussed it in the streets. They called me a genius, a demon, a perverse prophet. I was flattered. But what truly struck me? For the first time in my life, I began to earn something from my words. The irony was that The Raven itself brought me only about $9. Imagine, a poem that became an icon of literature earned me as much as a decent meal for $3. But I did not complain. I was used to it. Newspapers praised me, invited me to readings. I walked the streets knowing people turned to look. For the first time, I felt I was close to becoming who I had dreamed of being. But it was then that my heart began to break. Virginia fell ill. Her cough grew worse. Blood on her handkerchief. Fever. Silence between attacks. I knew that sound. It was the sound of my mother, my brother, my friends. It was the voice of tuberculosis, a disease you cannot escape. We lived in a cottage at Fort Clinton, in poverty, almost on the margins of life. I wrapped Virginia in an old coat, covered the windows with newspapers to keep out the draft. Sometimes we ate only once a day. I sought odd jobs, wrote on commission, edited. But everything was crumbling. It felt as if death itself had settled in our bedroom, waiting for the right moment. I wrote like a man possessed. Madness in every story, foreboding loss in every poem. I created the Black Cat, the Telltale Heart, the Cask of Amontillado, the Tomb of Ligeia. I wandered between fiction and reality, increasingly unsure where the line was. In January 1847, Virginia died. I remember that day down to the last sound. I sat beside her, held her hand, she smiled. Her lips whispered my nickname, Eddie, then only silence, stillness, and cold. I closed her eyes and realized I was alone. Utterly alone, in a world I no longer understood. After her death, I nearly lost my mind. I left. I wandered through cities. I tried to fall in love, to propose, to find new footing. My letters were filled with pain and despair. I offered my hand to women I barely knew, but these were not attempts at love. They were attempts to bring Virginia back in someone's form, voice, or gesture. I returned to Richmond. I began giving lectures. I spoke about poetry, rhythm, the meaning of sound in a stanza. People came, many people. I was interesting to the public again. I wrote articles, composed new works. But my health was failing. My heart beat out of rhythm. I suffered from dizziness, memory lapses, chest pain. I began drinking again, at first, a little, then more often. But it wasn't about the alcohol. It was a symptom, not the cause. I simply no longer knew why I should live. Everything I loved was gone. In 1849, I became engaged again to Sarah Elmira Royster, my youthful love. She was a widow. We corresponded. She said yes. I believed that perhaps I could still start anew, that the rest of my life could be spent not in solitude, not in shadow, not in longing. But 2 weeks before the wedding, I vanished. They found me in Baltimore on the street, unconscious. I was dressed in someone else's clothes. They took me to a hospital. I came to in fragments. I saw the ceiling, the doctor's face, a white wall. I raved. I screamed Virginia's name. I wept. I died. On the 7th of October, 1849, I passed away. The cause of my death remains unknown. Some say alcohol, others rabies. Some claim typhoid. Some are certain I was murdered or used in political schemes, or perhaps I simply died because I could no longer bear the weight of my life. They buried me without ceremony in a cheap cemetery in Baltimore, almost without words, almost without sound, and then the legend began. My stories were reprinted. My poems were quoted. Poets and writers spoke of me. They called me the creator of the detective genre, the father of psychological horror, the nameless poet. People visited my grave, leaving flowers. Someone even began coming every night with a bottle of cognac and roses. To this day, no one knows who it was. My works were studied, analyzed, adapted. They were turned into comics, films, music. I became a symbol, an image. And, as often happens, the dead man became more alive than when he breathed. They remember me for The Raven, for Ulalume, for The Fall of the House of Usher. But if you want to understand who I was, look deeper. I was a child who lost his mother, a husband who lost his wife, a writer who lost reality. I was a man who screamed into the darkness and heard his own echo. My name is Edgar Allan Poe, and if a poem of love laced with horror, or a story where fear lives in the mirror, ever stirs your soul, know that it is I, walking once more through the pages of your memory. What do you think of my story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Like and subscribe. And this is not goodbye.